very demanding, you know.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Balie. My name is Veronica Baas, and tonight I have the honor to be speaking to Paul Lynch. For the most part, we will be talking together about his wonderful book, but I've also invited two other guests, Teun Voete and Tasha Arendt, to respond to his book. Paul, you're from Ireland. It's always a bit weird to explain someone's biography, but I will tell the audience. He's an award-winning novelist of novels like Beyond the Sea and Grace and Black Snow and Red Sky in the Morning. But tonight we are here to talk about his latest novel, which has won the 2023 Booker Prize, Prophet Song. I loved it. I was deeply moved by it. And we are here tonight because of the Dutch translation, which is out by Prometheus and which has been translated by Tjadine Steeman and Lidwien Biekman as Het Lied van de Profeet, which is here in the Dutch edition. So you can all read it in Dutch from now on as well. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Yes, thank you. So winning the Booker Prize means sharing your book with an enormous audience, huge readership. Have you been able to connect over the book with all your readers?
Well, it's too big. The scale of it is so enormous that you don't truly get to connect with the readership. I mean, this is lovely. This is very intimate, you know. But most of you probably haven't read the book yet. But I am meeting a lot of people on the road. But the Booker is just the scale of it is like. For a writer like me, who's played on the margins for quite some time, not down the centre of the court, it's a shock because it's like this: the lights are suddenly turned on and they're turned on you,
and so bright.
And and like the Booker, it's the biggest book prize in the English language. So it's like the day after you win it, I think there was 3,000 pieces of media from around the world with my name in it. That's you're trying to take that in is it's unusual because also the thing about the Booker is it's the one every writer it's coveted. I joke 90% of writers will admit to wanting to win the Booker and the other 10% are lying. And
which camp were you before?
Oh, I was 90% openly would like to win it. But the thing is, you don't think you will. Because it's the odds of that level of alignment, of that amount of luck, of the right book, perhaps the right time, the right jury, the right year. There's just so many things are required for you to win it. And so I always just thought, well, this is not going to come my way, But it's nice to long list. It would be lovely to shortlist. Even shortlisting in itself is actually winning. That's generally accepted. That alone will change your career. But to win it, I think the book is at the moment going to be in 32 or 33 languages, and it's just going up.
That's crazy.
Whereas beforehand I just had the major European languages. So it's a different reality, and it's such a different reality that I was in my car the week after I came back to Dublin after winning it, because I had to do they grab you when you win it, and they don't let you go, and you have to do an immense amount of media. And like the day after winning it, I think I did 23 interviews the next day. Television, radio, and newspapers, and they just grab you for that week. But I got back home and I was in my car, my 16-year-old car, in the decidedly working class area of Dublin that I live in, and I'm stopped outside the traffic lights, and I just had this thought, and it was, I know that Paul Lynch won the Booker Prize, and I know that I'm Paul Lynch. But I don't know that I've won the Booker Prize. And so it took a while to align my own sort of...
To integrate it.
To integrate it, yeah. And of course, the world integrates it for you, because everywhere you go, it's people, looking at you.
Asking it. The first question they ask. Yes. I'm sure there are a lot of things that needs to be in order to win the Booker Prize, but I think first and foremost, you need to write an excellent book.
It probably helps, I suspect.
I do think it helps. And I certainly thought Prophet Song was that. And I wanted to dive in, actually, right in. And I've asked you to write the opening paragraph, to take along the audience with.
To read from the
it.
opening. Okay,
Yes.
yeah, okay. A couple of minutes. You can bear with me for a few minutes. The night has come, and she has not heard the knocking, standing at the window looking out onto the garden. How the dark gathers without sound the cherry trees. It gathers the last of the leaves, and the leaves do not resist the dark, but accept the dark in whisper. Tired now, the day almost behind her, all that still has to be done before bed, and the children settled in the living room, this feeling of rest for a moment by the glass. Watching the darkening garden, and the wish to be at one with this darkness, to step outside and lie down with it, to lie with the fallen leaves and let the night pass over, to wake then with the dawn and rise renewed with the morning come. But the knocking. She hears it pass into thought, the sharp, insistent rapping, each knock possessed so fully of the knocker, she begins to frown. Then Balie, too, is knocking on the glass door to the kitchen. He calls out to her, "Ma'am," pointing to the hallway without lifting his eyes from the screen. Eilish finds her body moving towards the hall with the baby in her arms. She opens the front door and two men are standing before the porch glass, almost faceless in the dark. She turns on the porch light and the men are known in an instant from how they are stood. The night-cold air suspiring, it seems, as she slides open the patio door. The suburban quiet. The rain falling almost unspoken onto St. Lawrence Street, upon the black car parked in front of the house. How the men seem to carry the feeling of the night. She watches them from within her own protective feeling. The young man on the left is asking if her husband is home, and there is something in the way he looks at her, the remote yet scrutinizing eyes that make it seem as though he is trying to seize hold of something within her. In a blink she has sought up and down the street, seeing a lone walker with a dog under an umbrella, the willows nodding to the rain, the strobings of a large TV screen in the Zajic's house across the street. She checks herself then, almost laughing, this universal reflex of guilt when the police call to your door. Ben begins to squirm in her arms, and the older plainclothes man to her right is watching the child. His face seems to soften, and so she addresses herself to him. She knows he too is a father. Such things are always known. That other fellow is much too young, too neat and hard-boned. She begins to speak, aware of a sudden falter in her voice. "He will be home soon, in an hour or so. Would you like me to give him a ring?" "No, that will not be necessary, Mrs. Stack. When he comes home, could you tell him to call us at his earliest convenience? This is my card." "Please, call me Eilish. Is there something I can help you with?" "No, I'm afraid not, Mrs. Stack. This is a matter for your husband." The older plainclothesman is smiling fully at the child, and she watches for a moment the wrinkles about the mouth. It is a face put out by solemnity, the wrong face for the job. "It is nothing to worry about, Mrs. Stack." "Why should I be worried, Garda?" "Yes, indeed, Mrs. Stack. We don't want to be taking up any more of your time, and aren't we damp enough this evening making calls? It'll be hard work getting ourselves dry by the heater in the car." She slides the patio door closed, holding the card in her hand, watching the two men return to the car, watching the car move up the street. It brakes for the junction and its tail lights intensify, taking in the look of two eyes that gleam. She looks once more onto the street, returned to an evening's quiet, the heat from the hall as she steps inside and shuts the front door, and then she stands a moment examining the card and finds she has been holding her breath. This feeling now that something has come into the house. She wants to put the baby down. She wants to stand and think, seeing how it stood with the two men and came into the hallway of its own accord, something formless yet felt. She can sense it skulking alongside her as she steps through the living room past the children. Molly is holding the remote control over Balie's head, his hands flapping in the air. He turns towards her with a pleading look. "Ma'am, tell her to put my show back on." Eilish closes the kitchen door and places the child in the rocker, begins to clear from the table her laptop and diary, but stops and closes her eyes. This feeling that came into the house has followed. She looks to her phone and picks it up, her hand hesitating. She sends Larry a message, finds herself again by the window watching outside, the darkening garden not to be wished upon now, for something of that darkness has come into the house.
Thank you. Are you someone who starts writing their book at the beginning?
Yes, always.
Always.
Yeah. I write linearly. I never jump forward. There's a very good reason for that. What I'm looking for, I mean, it starts with the language. I'm looking for the cadence, the incantation, the song, that sense that you are entering into a piece of music. And so that music must flow with the feeling of events. And so the music will be open to what happens. It will be open to the story as it evolves, and it will try and meet the moment that it's in. And also, there's that thing that I aim for, which is under the line, just that feeling of inevitability, that feeling that it's like a series of equations that's going on. There's a logic underneath this because of this, because of this, because of this. And when you build that into the sentences, when you build that into the story, jumping forward would kill it, because then you're creating something that's outside that time. And I'm deeply interested as a writer in entering into the feeling of time, the feeling of the now that the characters are in. And so how I write is I write in the present tense. I write in close third person. So there's no sort of omniscient narrator. We only ever know as much as Eilish knows in the unfolding moment that she's in. And so it's like a way of inhabiting her consciousness in third person when you get right up beside her. And at the same time, it's allowing me to unfold the story in a kind of unknowingness. She doesn't know what's going to happen next. The reader doesn't know what's going to happen next. And so that feeling of clockwork, of inevitability, of the Swiss watch underneath is really important.
Yeah. I'm always almost afraid to decalibrate the rhythm, but if you want to sketch us the main setup and the main characters, because you dive into the story immediately, and suddenly, but you do get this sense of modern day Dublin. The story is kind of set in the now. You follow a mother with 4 children, one very young.
Yeah.
She's a scientist. It starts out very normal, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. Some people assume, due to the nature of what's unfolding, that it's set in the future. And the book doesn't say that. It doesn't say that it's set in the future. It doesn't. It could also be a counterfactual present. The book doesn't say. It allows room for those interpretations, and there's many reasons for that, which we may get into, and so when the book opens, it's the feeling of Dublin now. At least for me, it's a Dublin that I know. It's the known world, and Eilish Stack is in the known world. She's in life in modern Ireland as she knows it. It's just that some things are subtly different. In the background, there has been the election of a populist government. Democratic norms are just beginning to slide. So there is that sense of, like, Ireland has not had the secret police up until now. So that's the GNSB knocking on the door, the Garda National Services Bureau. Ireland does not have secret police. And so that's something that's suddenly quite new. And she knows that. And she knows that what's been said about them is a little bit worrying. And so her response, obviously there, what's come into the house is the state.
Yes.
The state has suddenly entered into the family's life in a way that's It's troubling, and yet life is normal, and it's normal in such a way that everybody who's living through this is in denial about what's actually going on, and the refrain that runs kind of silently all the time, and people say it is, well, this can't be allowed to happen. This isn't going to happen. So people are living in denial. And it's very normal. We all do this. I mean, it's very difficult to ascertain change. How do you gauge change in your own life? Even in your personal life, things change so slowly. You don't see your face changing in the mirror. You don't see, the relationship you're in turn toxic. You don't see these things. They're so gradual. They sneak up on you until they're too big to ignore. It's the same with society. It's the same with the changes. And I encountered this for myself. Just before I started writing this book, I was rereading Hermann Hesse's Steppenwolf, a book that he wrote in 1927. And I had read that book in my early 20s, way back in the late 90s, probably about 1999. And there was a page in that book that was really instructive for me. I always remembered it. It was Harry Haller is the sort of the anti-hero in the book, and he's just looking out at Germany in 1927 through, it's Hesse really who's looking at that, and he's describing the complete fragmentation of the politics. He's describing the anti-Semitism and the xenophobia and just how it all paraded openly. And he said the next destruction's inevitable. It's coming. The next war's coming. And that was in 27. And I remember being amazed that Hesse saw that so clearly. But I also remember being amazed at just the idea of being alive during such a period of time. Because to me in 1999, of course, the 90s was problematic in its own way. But at the same time, Francis Fukuyama had told us all that history had come to an end. We'd reached sort of peak civilization. Everything was great. Politics was... It wasn't banal, but it wasn't far off banal. Life felt pretty banal. There was nothing to fight for anymore in a major way. And so that idea of that level of disruption just in the West, in Europe, in the war that we're in now seemed to be impossible. But when I reread it, I experienced a chill and I went, oh my gosh, this is now. We're seeing this openly now. We're seeing this happening in European politics in many different ways, because nothing repeats in directly the same way. Everything takes new forms and it skulks around in different guises and different shapes, but I recognized it. And that's when I saw that the pot of water that I'd been in, the temperature had just gone up and up and up, and I hadn't noticed it. And that's the beauty of fiction too, that when you read a classic novel, you're never the same person twice. You go back to Dostoevsky or Tolstoy or Woolf or any of these great writers, you realize how much you've changed in the intervening period. You are no longer that kid. You're now suddenly that adult, and you realize what you're now getting out of that author is so much deeper and so much more. All these extra layers that you missed the first time in your blissful ignorance, and. But you also sometimes, with a great writer, can also see how your society has changed, how the world you're in has been altered.
Yeah.
And so fiction is a magic mirror like that. And so that's when I realized that shit had changed.
Shit had changed.
And
yeah. So Eilish, the main character in your book, she is vaguely aware of society changing, and then this sudden change happens in her personal life.
Yeah. Well, the key thing is Larry, right?
Yes.
And so...
So tell us what happens with Larry.
Yeah, I mean, they want to speak to Larry because Larry works for the Teachers Union of Ireland. He's a senior trade unionist. And I suppose, I always sort of bristle a little bit when you get sucked into the political side of things, because I am a novelist and I don't call myself a political novelist, and we can talk about that later. But there's obviously a political dimension to the book, and I get asked all the time, well, how do you know what's too far? Where are the tipping points? And I'm not a political scientist, but I offer as a suggestion what happens early in the book, which is that Larry is taken in by the GNSB, and he's asked. The Teachers Union of Ireland are getting ready to do a big march, a big protest, and he's asked to prove to the state that his behaviour as a trade unionist is not seditious towards the state. And so if you have been living in a liberal democracy all your life, where the freedom, the right to march is just a fundamental right, that's one of the defining features of the world that we live in. You can march, you can protest. When that's taken away from you, that's the moment when when it's all in trouble. And so Larry has disappeared in the book. He's taken in and he doesn't come back. And that's the pivot. That's the moment where everything changes for Eilish.
Yes. And when I was reading the book, I was constantly feeling this state of anxiety that Eilish is feeling. Like she's trying to estimate, doesn't know how to start, how to get knowledge about where her husband is, maybe get him back. She's taking care of her father and her children, tries to continue doing her job.
Yes, yeah.
And you just, I felt this was so overwhelming, and the anxiety and...
The anxiety is really important because I want the reader to feel her alienation, her sense of alienation. And the alienation is living in a world that's unraveling, where you cannot see the monster. You cannot see the thing that you're up against. You cannot truly measure it. You cannot understand it. You cannot comprehend it because it's beyond, the scale of it is too great. And the unraveling doesn't happen. It doesn't happen up front under your... She's living a normal life in a European country, and so you know that sense of alienation is really important. Where she can't see it.
No.
She can hear about it on the news. She can hear bits and pieces, but you don't see it. It's not visible to you in many different ways. And so that alienation is something we all feel in our own lives in many different ways, and it's something that I'm really interested in. At the same time, it was really important in this book that I paid attention to the complexity of just the real, of her life, of her domestic reality. Because I'm really interested in this, is, you know, the question that starts to enter into the book is, you know, how do you know when to leave? We all ask ourselves this question. You watch the documentaries, you know, you watch the Shoah documentaries, or you watch any of these things, and you say to yourself, but I would have known. I would have known when to get out. And the book says, well, really, would you? I don't think so. Because the complexity of the problem is immense. And this is what the book is partly exploring. Eilish, she has 4 kids. She's an infant. She's got 3 teenagers of different complexities. They all are going through different things. You know, Molly is you know, in top of the league in hockey. You know, Mark is doing his leaving cert. You know,
which is like his high school exam.
The high school exam, you know, he wants to go into medicine. And Balie, her 12-year-old, has just been a 12-year-old, you know, and been difficult. And you've got all this going on. At the same time, she has a career. She works for a pharmaceutical company, you know, and she's a senior executive. She's trying to deal with that. She's dealing with the fact that her husband has just been gobbled up by the state. And at the same time, her father is sliding into dementia. But he too was a scientist. And so he has these moments of startling lucidity. And he says to her, Eilish, you know, there's this moment, he says, Eilish, you took the degree. You understand what the real is. You understand what reality is. He says, but you have to realize what they're doing. He says, once you take control of the institutions, you can start to change the narratives. And when you change the narratives, then you change the reality. And that's what they're doing. And he says to her, you need to leave. And she says, I can't bloody well leave. Look at, how can I leave this? You know, and her sister Anya lives in Canada. And Anya says to her, they have this sort of mildly antagonistic sisterly relationship. And
keep texting each other, not responding.
But Anya says to her at one point, history is a silent record of those who did not know when to leave. And Eilish says, well, that's all very well for you to say, you know, but like, how can I leave? Larry's been arrested, and, you know, look at Dad. What if he falls and breaks a hip? What then? And it's that simple. So you're embedded in the world that you live in, and our identities are layered. We have these very complex layers, and our layers are made up of all these versions of ourselves. And so what I realized writing this book, what I learned about it is that the problem of like sort of just that simple idea of free will is, oh, well, I could go anytime I like. It's a very childish view of it, that there's actually very little free will. When you're caught up in the mechanism of your life, there's no such thing. And when you're caught up, your mechanism within the giant mechanism, it just doesn't exist at all. And so, and for somebody to truly leave, to make that decision, let's say, for example, to get on one of those boats to cross the Mediterranean, like from Syria, which had been in my thoughts when I was writing this book too. You realize that for somebody to do that, all those identities have to be unplugged one by one by one by one until you're no longer a person, you're a thing. And when you're a thing, when you're a non-person, then you will leave because you've nothing left. That's when you will get on that boat. That's when you will take your kids with you and get on one of those boats, when there's nothing left to stay for and you don't exist in that place. And so that's some of what this book's exploring.
Yes. Yeah, and I did read your book as fundamentally about how people respond to repression and later on war, and because of this, I've asked two people to relate their own response to war and repression and their own experience, and relate it to the book. And first, I've asked Tasha Arendt, and she's a Belarusian artist, having left her native country. And through art, she tries to offer insight in this process of empowerment, both her own and that of the generation that sparked the Belarusian protests in 2020. And I've asked her to respond to your book.
Thank you. Nice to meet you, Paul. It was an interesting adventure actually to write about situation in Belarus, and I tried for many times, and what I found myself in, that I read a beautiful text, but I imagine myself reading it and I cannot. So I just, maybe 3 years ago, 4 years ago, it was, we were all very much inspired, we were brave, we were not thinking about censorship or any kind of fear. And now situation changed, and I thought, like, what can I do? So I called a friend. She's a journalist, Franka, and she worked a lot with Belarus. And she said, like, why don't you write about things which you cannot say? Because it's also talking about real situations that when you're afraid, when you silence yourself. I was deleting these drafts, and I was just like trying, what can I say? And I said, okay, I'm going to think about actually the thing about fear. And recently I had a conversation, interesting conversation with Eric, artist, he's here also, about fear and how it affects us. And I think it's interesting that fear actually has some purpose in general in life, because when you encounter some dangerous situation, it makes you kind of step out. And maybe like as a child, if you, for example, go somewhere and you burn your hand, like you just go away, right? But I think when you expose for a long time to fear, that your body starts to react in a different way. And if it's real or imaginable, your body accumulates a lot of fear. So sometimes you react in a way that is maybe not correspond to situation. It just grabs your body. And that's how it works. And I think the worst what kind of these oppressive governments can do, because people have natural curiosity to life and exploration and being active. And also what happened in Belarus, people become very active and very felt really empowered. And what basically repression can do, it's fear people to act or just express themselves in a certain way. And, I thought I was brave, but it did affect. So after like some years, I say, okay, I really didn't feel like talking at all. This paragraph I deleted, sorry. What I found interesting, when you speak about fiction, it actually makes things easier. And especially what I had experienced myself, when you speak, you say, oh, okay, this is about Belarus, so I can step out. This situation in Syria doesn't concern me so much. I live here, we live in democracy, everything is good, so people can distance themselves. And when, as a book placed basically in a Western country, you have opportunity to step in the shoes and imagine how it could be and how could it affect me in a personal way. But what I noticed, what is interesting for me, well, I don't know if you all read book or not, the protagonist, Eilish, she has actually a reference that she starts to feel that she's losing some of her rights, some of her, she feels that her rights being disturbed and stripped away of this rights. And I thought it's interesting because during elections in 2020 in Belarus, there were people who were talking about constitutional rights. And I remember how sometimes it felt for me surprising because, you know, yeah, of course, there is a constitution and things, but we know that elections were never fair for the last 20 years. So it's not working. And the difference, I guess, with democracy, that if you have experience, the feeling that you have rights, it's different. But if you haven't experienced that elections can be free and then you have a right of choice, where do you find this norm? How do you refer to something which is, I'm losing, because maybe you never had it before? Another big difference I found with really countries which experienced a long time of autocratic governments is the perception of autonomy and choice. And the protagonist, Eilish, she clearly struggles, but also holds ownership of her decisions. And I guess the difference with big dictatorship is that the government kind of holds ownership over people's autonomy. So when you start to protest, it's not your kind of, from one side, from your point of view, yeah, you are fighting for your autonomy of choice. But from the perspective of the state, you're taking something away from them because they own your autonomy and your way of thinking and what is right and what is wrong. So in a way, just protecting your freedom of choice or your freedom of expression, you kind of you can feel guilty because you take away the power of the state. And I just posed for myself a question: how do you change the order of things that were established before you were born, before you could see actually the real democratic values? The bad things about violence and all kind of things that they sometimes overthrow good things. And what was, I think, special in Belarus and many other countries during protests, that people did feel empowered, and this feeling of unity and support is quite a strong feeling. If you once experience in a life, is like people unite around ideas. They see that other people share their values. They can feel dignity and power of choice, and actually, just inspired to act. And when you have this huge wave of repressions, mostly you would remember this violence. But if we come back and remember what was sparked people, I think it's also remember to see what's been built. And in case of Belarus, for example, there was a lot of cultural activities. There are a lot of spark in people's connections, which you couldn't destroy. That's something that was built and that impacted people who participated in that. And but what, of course, is difficult because when you are part of situation, it's difficult to reflect. You know, how is it and what's happened. And in a way, in this book, you know, you can see the situation from a third-person perspective, so you can reflect and compare situations. Recently, I read a report on human rights violation in Belarus, and it was also for me like refreshing to find a language how people describe the situation, because, you know, when you experience some violation, you say, oh my God, this is so bad, this is horrible. That's how you try to attract attention. But when I read it in a language like systematic, widespread, and gross human rights violation, it's interesting that it gives a ground that even if you cannot stop this violation right away, it's important to give it a correct language so you don't lose your ground where is good and where is evil. And I think in general, I feel recognized. I feel seen. I mean, this book is in a way brings a lot of anxiety because the way it's written. But it's interesting, that it makes an audience to put themselves in the shoes, and it's not anymore like a dictatorship that happens elsewhere and I can distance myself, but it's more about like, wow, I could be through this. How would I feel? How would I react? And maybe, hopefully, it can bring more empathy to people when they meet somebody else who left their country because of this. Yeah, and I hope, and one more thing, I think, in Belarus, people experienced a lot of things as in many other countries, but what empowers is a power of small action. And I think, I also had some moments where it's like easier to give up on and just get depressed. But for me personally, it was not a solution. And when I saw other, artists and writers, people who find inside their power to continue going, to continue believing in their values, it's really inspiring. So I hope you also have some inspiration. Thank you.
Tasha mentions this spark of trying to fight what is happening. The eldest son of Eilish also has this spark. How does she relate to that? To her son not hiding, not sitting it out?
Well, he's not in denial. And he confronts her about it, and he says, you're in complete denial of what the reality is. You're in denial of what's happened to our father. You need to wake up, is what he's saying to her. And in his case, what's happening to him is he's been what's the word? He's going to join the rebels. So he's been radicalized, and Eilish is not. But what we see in the book is how it does enter into the body. What's occurring enters into the body in different forms as trauma does. And there's a moment, when at peak unraveling, shall we say, I don't want to give away too much of the book, but we're at peak unraveling, and Eilish is hiding under the stairs with her children, and she's got her infant son, and she understands that the anxiety that she feels, the trauma that she feels, is being transmitted to her child, and her child is absorbing this and will carry it in his body into adulthood without knowing what it was, will carry this anxiety, will become part of his neurology, and he will then later act out as an adult without knowing why he's carrying what he's carrying. And so it's like an infection, and you see all the different children. Molly starts to become inward and depressive and starts to withdraw. This was an outward going child, a sporty child. As you say, Mark becomes radicalized and withdraws from the family and ends up leaving, and because he has to listen to his conscience. And then there's Balie, who Eilish makes a terrible mistake of not telling him the truth at the start. When the father has been taken, she can't tell him because she thinks he's too young to be told. She wants to protect him from the reality, but it's a huge mistake because it damages their relationship, and that becomes a thing that runs throughout the book. But there's a moment when she does tell him, and she sees his understanding of the world come undone. She sees that sense of, what it is you grow up with, how the ground underneath you flies into the air, like that the sense of the world that you're a kid doesn't hold, it's gone. And so, like, it's a tragic thing to have to tell that to a child.
And also, how much she herself remains in denial, I'd like to ask you to read another scene which I found particularly moving, where she and her daughter are, I think, in the middle of the night, talking about taking it all in.
Well, this is again. It goes back to Molly. Not Molly is not doing well. Where am I now? She finds herself standing before Molly with her hands on her hips. I asked you please to go downstairs, she says. Molly watching her strange face, and then she begins to shout, "We're going to die! We're going to die!" Eilish yanking her by the hand. She pulls her out of bed, telling her enough is enough, walks her into the bathroom and runs the shower and undresses her, puts her under the water without regard for the cold, watching the slight white body make no resistance but for the lifting of an arm to cover her breasts. "You're not going to die," Eilish says. "I just want you to go downstairs. The fighting is not going to come near the house." Eilish steps into the shower and begins to wash Molly in hurried strokes with the flannel. She bends to her knees to wash the girl's feet. Molly is shivering, Eilish still wearing her clothes. Her knees are sodden, the arms of her blouse wet through. "You have to snap out of this," she says. "Who is it you want your father to meet when he comes through the door? The daughter he left behind or a ghost?" She looks up towards Molly and sees a smiling, vacant look. "But Daddy isn't coming back," Molly says. "He isn't coming back because he's dead. Didn't you know? Did they not tell you he is dead? I wonder why." The hand stopped upon the body, the breath caught in the throat. The flannel falls from her hand as she hinges slowly to standing. She has taken Molly's chin between finger and thumb and lifts her face the better to see into the eyes that swivel in refusal to look at her. "Don't you ever say that again," she says. "Don't you ever even think such words. Your father is not dead because nobody said so. I don't know what you might have heard, but none of it is true. Right now there is no truth. You don't know and nobody knows. The truth of anything cannot be known. What has been stored in the body, what has been locked in the heart gives release through Molly's mouth into sobbing, her hands squeezing the air. Eilish pulling her into a hug, whispering to her, stroking the back of her head. "We have entered into a tunnel and there is no going back," she says. "We just need to keep going and going until we reach the light on the other side." To me, when I read that now, because I haven't read that in a long time, but it seems to be emblematic of that not knowing, that inability to truly understand what's unfolding, because Eilish is in the labyrinth. You know, and in many ways, I consider myself like, you know, I think I'm a tragedian. I think my writing is tragic. That's.
I think so too.
Yeah, that's what I. But you know, I'm trying to reconfigure what the Greeks did in an entirely modern way, and you know, one of the things the Greeks had, what they demonstrated so beautifully, is our sort of our philosophical blindness, our human blindness, our inability to interpret reality. You know, they demonstrated as the fates with their prearranged problems that you could not see and you act against, and then it all comes down upon you. But they demonstrated how we act with certainty in our lives, but we reap always this bitter crop of the unforeseen because we're all in the labyrinth. And Eilish is in the labyrinth all the way through this book, and I'm fascinated by that idea. You know, that because we live in a time where we're convinced that we're at this sort of peak rationality, peak of knowledge. We live in the data stream. We live at this sort of this degree of self-awareness and knowledge of metrics and data that's almost, it's obscene. And we're convinced that we know reality, we know the real, and yet we're completely blind to what we're blind to. We miss what's under our nose. We miss this sort of what makes us human, which is our deeper rationality. And part of that is our inability to read the world. And so we always act with certainty, but we're meeting the unknown in major ways all the time. And I'm very interested in demonstrating that, creating a fiction to capture that reality. You know, both Woolf and Faulkner, I think, made the same metaphor of, you know, that we are all in the darkness with a match, It's all we have. We just walk through the darkness with the match. This small light that we have, you know. Knowledge casts only a small light. There's an immense darkness around us. And life is fundamentally strange. And I think that fiction should speak to that. I think that fiction should articulate that problem that we have. And especially in the times that we're in, is to really demonstrate our unknowing and to remind us of that.
Yes. In the scene, you referenced the fighting that's going on, and I want to move a bit to the violence that is escalating and escalating more and more. That is actually also... Do you consider this book a war novel?
No, I don't. I mean, there are aspects of war in it, but do I consider it a totalitarian novel? No, I don't. There are aspects of totalitarianism. You know, to me, it's breaking all genres. It's doing something that's actually getting closer to myth than anything else, from how I conceive of it. And there was a quote that I wanted to use from Cormac McCarthy's *The Crossing* as an epigraph for the book that spoke to my intentions, and we couldn't get it in time because Cormac was dying, unfortunately, and passed away soon after. We couldn't get permission in time for publication, and I was quite sad about both things because I revered McCarthy, but this quote was perfect. And the line went something like this. It said, you know, the task of the narrator appears to be an easy one. He appears to be required to choose his tale from among the many that are possible. But that, of course, is not the case. The task is rather to make many of the one. So when you make many of the one, you get to myth, you get to universality, you get to that point where one story can contain all stories or many stories. One story can carry an enormous freight. And so that's what I was seeking to do in this book, was to take within to find within the contemporary a language that could actually embrace the mythic, that could create space for the mythic to enter. And so this book, to me, is always in conversation with the past, the present, and the future. And so when people say, "Oh, it's a dystopian novel," I always say, "Well, really?" Because dystopian fiction, for a start, is always has a very specific political agenda. It seems to know, it knows the answers to its own problems. And, well, I don't do that for a start. I consider the book as a series of questions. I'm not interested in messaging and providing answers. That's not how I work. The questions are more important than the answers. But also at the same time, you know, say dystopian fiction, it's pointed to the future, but this book is in conversation with the past. It's in conversation with the present. It's in conversation with the future. And so the mythic is always there. And there is a moment late in the book where Eilish has this epiphany. You know, she's been through the circles of hell and she has this epiphany. And it's that, you know, what you grow up hearing about this biblical apocalypse, you know, what the prophets are singing of the end of the world, that it's a myth. That the end of the world is always reoccurring. The end of the world is always a local event. It comes to your city, it comes to your town, it knocks on your door, and it becomes for you, your family, your people, the end of the world. That's the cataclysm. But for everybody else, it's something you watch on the news. It's the spectacle. You watch it on the news. And it passes into history. It passes into folklore. After enough time, it becomes the Iliad. It becomes myth.
Well, someone who has been present to a lot of other people's hell is Teun Voete. He's an anthropologist and a war photographer. And based on the book, he has selected some of the pictures that he has taken from various crises in his career. Teun, would you like to come forward and tell us a little bit about it?
I have 10 minutes. That's why I have this phone. Yeah, first of all, it's a big honor to be invited. And I read the book of Paul, and I've been photographing wars for 30 years. I'm basically a non-fiction guy. But I was very impressed with the book, very realistic. And I was actually on assignment last week in Tijuana. But I read it even on assignment. I read it just in 3 days. It was to put to say a horrible cliche, it was unputdownable page turner. I will show in 10 minutes some of my photos. I have very little time. 10 minutes. Normally I talk 2 or 3 hours about my work and about myself, but I will condense everything in 10 minutes. And luckily with images you can do that. Is there some technician who can? Oh shit, it's me. Yeah, okay. All right. Thanks for putting the light on. So basically, I learned photography by the uncle architectural photography. I went more into portraits and documentary and war photography, and I studied cultural anthropology on the side to satisfy my intellectual needs. I have been in 2010. I wound up in Mexico. I photographed the drug violence, the drug war. I was very much fascinated by how a functional country is sliding into complete dystopia and chaos, and levels of violence you only think happens in third world countries. I did a PhD on Mexican drug violence, and I've been working a little bit more on the theme of destabilization and social disintegration of drugs. I wrote a book on crystal meth, and currently I'm doing I just got back from Tijuana and work on a story on fentanyl crisis, the synthetic opioid that is turning the big cities in the West, San Francisco, Vancouver, Portland, Tijuana, in really hellholes. That's my work. One of my first photos in Yugoslavia, what was so very special about Yugoslavia, it was a very sophisticated country. I was traveling there in the 89 and 90 before the war. People were totally normal. They would never think this would happen to them. In 1991, the war in Croatia broke out. I went many times to Croatia, and people in Sarajevo, in Bosnia, they were even thinking 92, oh, this will not happen with us because we are very sophisticated, elegant, intelligent people. But suddenly the whole society broke down in a couple of months. And it was for me, and I'm still, what I see currently happening around me, and what is also portrayed very well in the book, is how a normal society can just break down, and once you break down a glass house, it's impossible to repair, and Yugoslavia is still Yugoslavia is still a mess. But somehow people survive, and they get very, very soon accustomed to the new abnormality, which becomes the new normal. This is photo I took in Chechnya, again, and just cleaning up your house after a Russian bombing raid. This is the refugees, and again, you have many as a war photographer. I cover many things in war: combat, destruction, arms profiting, black war marketing, but also civil life that goes on, but also refugees. And actually, this photo was used many times in public campaigns because people can relate to this, and it's basically a very ethical thing. People relate better to people from their own ethnic tribe. So this photo was used in many campaigns because it's a beautiful blonde child. It could be a Dutch kid, and as a war photographer, you always are a bit opportunistic as well. So you always think I should make money and I should sell my photos. Unfortunately, there's no more money left in my profession, but that's another complaint I have. This is basically, I was in Colombia. Colombia is also a pretty difficult country. I was there in late 1990s, early 2000s. These are dead rebels at the army base, and they just portrayed them, and all the local journalists are invited to photograph the dead bodies. I know what I like about this photo is the horror, of course, but also the reactions of the soldiers, the official Colombian army soldiers. That some of the people look disgusted, some of the people look scared, some of the people look curious, but everybody has a different reaction to this horror. It's basically a photo I took. It's sometimes the horror of war is very difficult to convey. And I was in Sierra Leone in 2000. I was actually on assignment for Vanity Fair to do a story about the diamond business with writer Sebastian Junger. And one of the war tactics of the rebels was amputating people to instill terror, to intimidate people. It's actually a very cheap but very powerful weapon of war, the same way as we see as sexual rape is a weapon of war. You intimidate, you humiliate, the opponents, and basically many people were asked in a very sadistic way if they want short sleeve or long sleeve. Short sleeve is they would cut your arm here. Long sleeve, cut your arm was a horrible war. I've been many times. I wrote actually a book about the war in Sierra Leone. I was myself nearly executed by rebels, and then I had like 10 minutes of sheer insanity of half an hour when 6 drugged up child soldiers were putting their guns at my head, and these were not revolvers but like M16s and Kalashnikovs. This is also like the enormity of war. Sometimes you just cannot. This was an aftermath of the Rwanda genocide, a refugee camp at the border of Congo, and suddenly a cholera epidemic broke out, and basically people are just dying. Thousands a day, and the scale of dying was completely surrealistic. And bodies were put in trucks and grown in mass grave. I got a lot of criticism on this photo. One people said, "Wow, you really took the photo when the body was." If you know anything about physics, if you throw something, there comes a point before the object turns down that it's complete. Has come to a standstill. The velocity is 0, and yes, I took the photo exactly at that moment. And people sometimes blame me for being ruthless and callous, but I'm a professional and I need to communicate. And the language of photography, you need sometimes some physical analysis of what's going on around you. This was also a very terrible photo I took in Bosnia, and this was after the town of Mostar had been liberated from the Serbs. And these are Serbian POWs, prisoners of war, that are forced to dig up a mass grave, and most probably of the people they have killed themselves. This was actually the first time I saw and I smelled a mass grave, and it's horrible. But once you smell, you never forget that smell. Guards on top, and these are the POWs. Photo I took in the morgue of Sarajevo. Again, I got a lot of criticism for this. People said the photo was too aesthetical, and people even accused me of putting the stretcher at the right angle. But of course, I don't manipulate my photos. And this photo was on the cover of the Dutch daily Het Parool. And people were very angry at me, at the photographer, but I said, "I'm sorry, I just photograph what is happening, and if you don't like it, you can just turn the page and drink your coffee, you know." This is a photo I took in Mostar, a little bit of an action photo. You have to cross. Sometimes our work is a little bit dangerous. You have to cross a street covered by ISIS snipers, but if you run really fast, nothing's going to happen. You really got to run. Some people use bulletproof vests, but these weigh 30 or 40 pounds, and then it slows you down. So my philosophy is just run really fast and zigzag a little bit. These are photos. A photo I took in Liberia, also on assignment for Vanity Fair magazine. These were the best days of my photographer. I used to work for Vanity Fair and National Geographic. Right now I'm just eking out a living as an anthropologist, but I don't want to complain. This photo are like government soldiers, and a lot of girls, they join the army because it's safer to run around with a weapon as being a subject of a civil war, subject to rape. Your family will be killed or robbed. So these girls joined the army, and actually this is one of my most strongest war photos. It's actually on my business card and the opening photo of my website. But actually it's not a war photo. It could also be a very trendy portrait for a hairdresser, for a Paris fashion photographer, because the girl has to have very nice London School of Economics, saxophone, and very emblematic weapons. The Kalashnikov is really good for photos because it has this really bent magazine. As a photographer, you learn to think into images. And I love the photo. It has different layers. The vulnerability, but they also look very fierce. They look very pretty. So this photo tells a lot. It has different layers, and I think good war photos should have different layers. This is the same moment, the child soldiers, and again, some are really drugged out, some are happy to see the photographer, some look a little bit suspicious. Then you got a guy on the truck with the badass 50 cal anti-aircraft gun, and these were the guys we're dealing with in Liberia. It was a bit tricky because they had heard rumors that 2 white journalists had wrote that their president was a cannibal, Charles Taylor, the president. But these were British journalists, but they thought it was us, and then the mood got a little bit tense, and we left. Liberia, a refugee camp in the center where people fled to, was shelled by mortars. People were just dying on the spot. This is another woman and a child. The man has been gravely wounded, and I think he didn't survive surgery. These were government soldiers, so you can even imagine how rebels would look like in Liberia. This is a murder scene in Mexico. In 2010, I went to photograph the war in Mexico, and then you can photograph violence at different ways. This is a very blunt way. You see all the guns. I think he was killed with 35 rounds from a Kalashnikov, taken from, you see the inspectors. This photo shows a little bit more emotion of a cop, a local cop, and you see he's just armed with a very stupid revolver, whereas the enemy is the cartels armed with Kalashnikovs, M16s, and whatever they have. Another murder scene I took in Juarez. Sometimes you really take gory photos. It's part of the story, and sometimes I feel like a voyeur, and then I realize that I am. But this is a little bit more a detail from someone who has been executed, and sometimes I photograph the whole scene. Sometimes I take a detail that's sometimes more, sometimes less is more. Our profession is not always that honorable. Sometimes people think we are honorable, but we are a little bit exploiting other people's misery. And basically people tell me, do you want to change the world? I say, no, I don't want to change the world. I just want to show what's going on. And basically a very famous war photographer, Tom McCullany, he's right now 70 or 60s. One of the most prolific British war photographers. He once said, I don't have the idea that my photo ever changed one thing in history, because you should never underestimate the cynicism of the people in power and what's the word, the slowness of the people to the inertia of the political leader. We photographed 4 or 5 years Yugoslavia, and just the killing went on, and killing still goes on. This is my latest project, Defending the Christ. I actually took this photo last week, and it takes time and social skills to get the trust of people to take these photos. But I think it's really important story, and I'm right now very much working in drugs. Not that I'm interested in drugs, I don't do drugs, but the whole destabilizing effects of drugs causing civil wars, social disintegration, and people dying on a large scale in civilized cities. I could go on and talk for hours, but this is a little bit, I hope it was not too hardcore. Thank you so much. Bye.
I will change it, though, to the next one. Thank you so much, Teun. So I feel a bit sadistic to expose everyone to this, but I asked Teun to give this presentation because I was very interested in your response, because I feel myself, this is also our life, what we live. We are exposed to the media. It's this continuous bombardment of images, of pictures. You become I personally become a bit giggly just now because it's just too much, and it's too, but you also numb down, you want to turn away. And somehow...
We live in the age of the spectacle.
You turn to it.
Yeah, and I've written about this, and I worked in journalism. I edited many foreign pages. I edited a lot of photographs, so I have huge love and respect for what I saw up there, because that's truth telling. The gaze is not being averted; he's not looking away, and that's so fundamental to telling the truth. And journalists do this, of course, but at the same time, part of the difficulty of the times that we live in is that the age has become defined by the spectacle. And so I think of my childhood in the 1980s, 90s, growing up with the television in the corner, and you're getting the news on the TV while you're eating your dinner, and what you're seeing is war zones and destruction and collapse, and you're eating your dinner, and it's not penetrating you, and over time the news ceases to move you in a certain kind of way, and this is normal. We have to have our self-defenses up, because if if we were truly to meet what we see, we might not actually be able to get out of bed in the morning. The power of a single photographic image is the distillation of truth like that. It resonates on a more higher, more powerful frequency than often the moving image does, because it's geometrically distilled truth. But when I was writing this book, I thought about, for example, Syria. I thought about how there were 2 million people had, I think, come into Europe, which was the greatest crisis since World War II, of a refugee crisis since World War II, and it was met with a large degree of indifference and resentment and anger and hostility, and there was I couldn't understand that, and when that child washed up on the beach, Alan Kurdi, I think he was 3 years old. I think it was a Turkish beach. There was a moment of collective recognition that maybe this was actually time for an attitude change, but nothing really changed. And politics around Europe lurched to the right in response to the incoming refugees, and things were changing because of it. And I was thinking as a writer, that a lot of fiction is, I hate to use the word bourgeois, but it is. A lot of what's called serious fiction is very comfortable. It averts its gaze. It often seeks to offer the reader solace of some kind. I'm not saying that it offers the happy ending, but it's not creating a magic mirror for the reader to stare at the Medusa. And so I thought about that. I thought about the role of fiction and how perhaps that I had to push deeper into the truth of things, just not to change things. Because I agree, I'm not setting out to cause any change. Auden once said, poetry changes nothing. I think he's right, and I hate to say it. As a citizen, I'd like to say, God, he must be wrong. But the part of me that's the writer, I think he's right.
But it changes the reader sometimes, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was asked today by a journalist if how's my response to watching the news now after reading this book, and it's a really good question, because the truth is it's changed me. On day 2 of Gaza, I broke down watching the news. I couldn't take it in, because to write this book, I had to live it. I had to really truly enter into that, and that was one.
I had to put down your book quite a lot, because it was just too much. So how was it to write that?
It's hugely challenging, but again, I was guided by a sense of truth, that of the importance of meeting this head on, and doing so in such a way that the reader would come with me, that the reader would trust me. And it's really important that you do that. That if you're going to ask the reader to go through the 9 circles of hell or to stare into the abyss, that they don't fall in. And so your job as a writer is to, in the same way that Virgil walked with Dante through hell, is to be the Virgil, is to offer some poetry and offer some grace, so that the reader doesn't fall into the abyss, but they need to confront the meaning of hell, and so I realized when I was writing this book that perhaps the way I was writing, the intensity of it, the way of entering into the moment, was perhaps offering a deeper form of empathy, because very often we all experience sympathy. But sympathy is not empathy. They're very, very different. Empathy is in fiction is the ability to feel it as if you're living it for yourself, as if you're inhabiting that space, so you feel it as your own. And that's what I was trying to do is by simulating it in Ireland. Well, for a start, I'm breaking down the barrier between you and the other. Whatever the other is, whatever your perception of them is, it's disappeared because I've just brought you into a simulation, and so that.
You still want to contend you're not a political writer,
but not because the reason I say this is because, first of all, political fiction most often is about solving problems. It's about writing towards something with knowing the answers. That's grievance, and I write about grief. Prophet Song is a lament of grief. It's about what doesn't change, what we cannot change, what we are through time, what human nature is, and the book is that's fundamentally what this book is about. So it's not political in that respect, and all of my books are the lenses that I use are always much broader. Like there has been a deluge of political fiction in the last 10 years, and very often for very good reasons. But my problem as a novelist is I think that serious fiction requires more than a single lens. I think the political lens is insufficient to the problem of reality, which is infinitely complex. And I think the job of the serious writer is to represent reality in the best way that you can in its complexity. I mean, we're all seriously limited in our ability to do that, but at the same time, you're trying to grab a hold of reality somehow. And so to use the political lens, it's just insufficient. And there's a danger with it too, because you're messaging, you're providing answers, you're saying to the reader, this is the answer to the problem. If only you'd listen, I'll show you the problem. And Stendhal warned beautifully and hilariously in The Red and the Black. He made up his own quotes very often and attributed them to other people. And he says, politics is the millstone around the neck of literature and drowns it in less than 15 minutes. And so, I agree with that. And so, to me, I write about grief. I write about what we are, what we cannot change, what the true meaning of loss is, what is unrecoverable. I write about our powerlessness as human beings. I write about the problem of dignity, what it is to be a human being in the world, the problem of meaning, the problem of just being alive and the complexity of being a human being in the world, and how much human being is in a human being. How deep do we go? What are we made of? What's the stuffing that we're made of? These are metaphysical problems. These are what I write about. And so while there are political dimensions to this book, and probably not to my other books, that does not make me a political writer.
Do you think you will be able to heal yourself through writing a new book, to recover? Is that something you want?
Writing's not therapy. I always say this to students. It's not therapy. Don't come at it looking for healing. Don't come at it.
But it's a bit of self-harm, maybe.
It's self-harm, of course it is, because you hurt yourself. My gosh, every book hurts me to write it. And it should do. It should hurt you. And it should hurt you psychologically, because Joseph Campbell, the great writer and psychologist, depth psychologist and mythographer, and he said, "The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure that you seek." And it's true for all of us in our daily lives, but it's also true for fiction. The story you don't want to write is probably the one you need to write. Why you have to ask yourself, why don't you want to write it? That's where the treasure lies. But you have to overcome yourself. You have to defeat the dragon to get the treasure.
Which dragon have you overcome to write this book?
Oh my God, it's a hydra with many heads. They keep growing back more and more and more. I cut them off, and there's 5 more.
It was a violent fight, that is for sure. And with that, I think we have time for some questions from the audience. Is there someone that wants...
Questions and not statements.
A question ends with a question mark.
Just immediately raise up question. Then if it's self-harm to write a book, then when you get a source of energy for next one?
Where do I get the source of energy? There has to be a recovery period.
All right.
Yeah, and then the ideas start to form, and they start to, other ideas come. They start to nucleate around some new obsession. There's always a new obsession. You don't know what it is, and then one day suddenly you have a sense of an opening, a sense of a problem, a sense of a scene, and you don't quite know what it is. And writing it means you have to unpack it. It's like an image from a dream. It's symbolically compressed, and sometimes you don't know what these images are, but they resonate. And so writing is taking the images and unpacking them and discovering your own symbolic truth, and your own themes start to emerge. So it's a communication with your subconscious. There's a very deep psychoanalytic aspect to writing that I'm fascinated by.
So do you receive relief when you let it out?
I have relief when I disappear. When I'm writing, I disappear.
When you enter in the cave.
Yeah, no, but when you're writing, you enter into a state of flow, like when you play sport, when you're dealing with an emergency crisis, when you're at peak state, you consciously disappear, another aspect of mind takes over, and it's a higher aspect of mind. You go into flow. It's been well documented in psychology and writing. When on a good day you just go into flow, that becomes really addictive because you're bypassing the problem of there not being milk in the fridge.
Which Balie has a lot in this book, by the way.
Yeah. It's a recurring motif in the book.
He's constantly looking for milk. Another question over there. I can also take it. Yeah, but it's easier if it's, yeah.
Hi. Can you elaborate a little bit on how it is to have a female protagonist as a male writer? Or why?
Why does that interest you?
Because
it doesn't interest me at all, but why does it interest you?
Yeah, okay, so I would find it easier to have a female protagonist myself. And not, I mean, I have this idea that there is something in the male brain that I don't know. So it says something about me more.
I mean, if you're a painter, you have to paint with all the colors. You know, that's your job. So you know, my job is to write with whatever's available. It's just not a concern for me. The question is always boils down to, you know, with fiction, is aesthetics and truth. You know, is it aesthetically true? Is the truth of the character, you know, psychologically true? I have to let my readers decide that, but generally the reports are excellent. So, you know, I've written female characters before. I really enjoy it. I find it liberating, in fact, to enter into the female psyche. I remember on my third book, the lady who's now my ex-wife said to me.
Was this to read it?
It wasn't the book that did it, but anyways. But she said to me, she said, like, how did you know? She said, you completely nailed a 14-year-old girl. You've completely done it. She said, why didn't you ask? But you didn't ask me any questions. She said, you just did it. How did you know? And I can't give an answer to that, but that's perhaps why I'm a writer, why I write fiction. It's because I pay attention.
Thank you. Hello, I'm yet to read your book, so probably this question, I would have different questions afterwards, but I was curious, have you heard of a novel by Lydia Chukovskaya called Sofia Petrovna?
No.
Maybe a good read if you have time.
Is it English? Is it in English?
I think so. You would be able to find it in English because when I read
I'm going to struggle to remember the name of it now.
When I read, I will remind through Veronica, because Sofia Petrovna is about a woman who is in a similar situation. Only it's not her husband, but her son who gets snatched. And he, of course, is in Stalin period and gets brainwashed and so on and so on. So, okay, I won't elaborate on that further, but I was curious.
There are no new stories, by the way.
Sorry?
There are no new stories.
Yes.
Like all the stories have been told throughout time.
Yes.
What artists get to do is we get to meet the moment that we're in the way that reflects our consciousness, our use of language, our sense of the cosmos. Every generation has a different inflection on that. And so art is always evolving. It's protean, it's always meeting the specific time that it's in. But what it's actually fundamentally chasing is as old as Sophocles, is as old as Homer. It goes back all the way back into the mists of time. All the stories have been told.
I'm aware. Thank you for explaining. I understand that your book is not Chukovskaya's book, but
that would be quite a claim.
Yes. So what I was going to ask,
I'm calling my lawyers.
No. I was about to ask. In her novel, the lady is a typist. And she seems powerless, but of course, as a typist, you have access to a type machine. You would be able to make flyers. You have tools to fight the system, and yet she's paralyzed, and she's brainwashed. it is for some reason that you chose a scientist. So
She's a rationalist.
like you said, she's an educated woman.
She's a rationalist, and she believes in rationality.
Right.
And that's.
Is she able to use
No, her
what
belief
she's
in
got?
rationality is what lets her down.
Right.
Perhaps.
I understand.
Yeah.
And what about Ireland? Because
This is 3 questions
Just
now. There have to
so
be
sorry.
other people.
I have one last question here.
One last question.
There was one last question on the back there.
It's funny you mentioned Ireland because I was about to ask a question about that as well. Because you're from Ireland, and of course the situation in the history of Ireland is different than the book, but did it in any way inspire you to write this book, The History of Ireland?
Well, what was it Auden again once said about Yeats? He said something to the effect, what was it? Mad Ireland moved you to tears, something like that. Or, you know, and so Ireland is the history of sorrow. And when you travel as a novelist around Europe and you meet people who talk about Irish literature, they talk about it as this veil of tears, this, you know, the ticking clock. Yeah, the ticking
You didn't
clock.
really rectify the reputation.
well, actually, yeah, but there's a difference here because what's happening in Ireland now is there is, I think a silent revolution is occurring, a cultural revolution that's not being articulated very well. But Ireland is post-Catholic now. The country is re-identifying itself. It's recalibrating. So my generation and the generation coming after me are at this extraordinary nexus point where, for the first time in history, we are unshackled from the theocratic country that we live in. And it was a theocracy. There's no mistake about that. You know, the shadow of the cross has been lifted. The church is gone. There's no power anymore. At the same time, we are at this amazing nexus point between the States and Europe. So Ireland's becoming globalized in terms of culture. And so there's this massive energy going on in the arts where artists are part of the conversation of what does it mean to be Irish. And so a lot of fiction that's come out of Ireland is actually not set in Ireland anymore, or it's got global themes. And this book is a global novel. There's just no doubt about it. That's what it is. Accidentally, it's not what I set out to do, but that's just part of what emerges. And so fictional movements, artistic movements, the really good ones often come out of turmoil. They often come out of cultural change. The period of Yeats and Joyce and Casey and all these great writers came out of a particular cultural moment of reinterpretation of what it meant to be Irish. And I think the exact same thing is happening at this moment. And so Ireland is a mess of grief and sadness and bad history and colonialization and terrorism and rain. Let's not forget the fucking rain. And all that's there. It's all there in silent layers behind the text.
Thank you so much, Paul Lynch. You can buy the Dutch version, Het Lied van de Profeet, right here. It's beautifully translated, and I would recommend everyone to read it in Dutch or in English. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you so much, Paul Lynch.
Thank you.